The shrill ringing of the phone cut through the smoke-filled room. Detective John Riley, startled, reached for the insistent device.
Detective Riley, we have a situation, sir. Homicide, elderly female, found dead in her apartment.
Riley's gut clenched. This was the third one in 6 months.
We need you at 48th and Elm, Detective, ASAP.
Riley hung up the phone, the weight of the unsolved cases pressing down on him. He stubbed out his cigarette, knowing sleep wouldn't come easy. John Riley was a man defined by his contradictions, a protector of the innocent, yet forever haunted by the darkness he faced every day. His apartment, a testament to his dedication to his work, was sparsely furnished, the walls adorned with maps and photographs of crime scenes past. He had dedicated his life to seeking justice, to being a voice for the voiceless. But somewhere along the way, he had lost a part of himself. He clung to the belief that he could still make a difference. The familiar routine of preparing for a homicide investigation was both comforting and unsettling. Riley moved through the motions with practiced ease. He dressed in his usual attire, a worn suit, a once crisp white shirt, and a tie that spoke of better days. He grabbed his coat and his trusty fedora. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into the belly of the beast. The city was alive with a million different sounds, a symphony of sirens and shouts. The rain hammered against the windshield of Riley's car, blurring the neon lights of the city. He navigated the slick streets with practiced ease, his mind already racing ahead. He knew the drill: secure the scene, interview the witnesses, follow the evidence. But these murders, they whispered of something darker. He lit a cigarette, the glowing ember a tiny point of defiance against the encroaching darkness. He would find this killer. He had to. The flashing blue and red lights of a dozen police cars painted the rain-soaked street in a kaleidoscope of chaos. Riley pulled up to the curb, the familiar scene sending a chill down his spine.
Detective Riley, sir. Glad you could make it.
Riley nodded curtly, his eyes already scanning the scene.
Give me the rundown, Riley said, his voice gruff. Victim's name is Eleanor Davis, 68 years old, retired schoolteacher.
The stairwell was narrow and dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and stale cigarette smoke.
No signs of forced entry, sir. Apartment's a mess, though. Looks like there was a struggle.
Riley listened intently, his mind absorbing every detail. They reached the third floor, the flickering fluorescent light casting long, distorted shadows. The apartment was small and cramped, the air heavy with the smell of death. A single white sheet covered the center of the room, the outline of a human form clearly visible. A figure stood hunched over the body, a silhouette against the faint glow of a flashlight.
Detective Riley, a voice said, turning to greet him. She's all yours, Riley, and this one's a real charmer.
Riley nodded, his gaze drawn to the sheet-covered form.
Jesus, Miller muttered. They didn't hold back on this one.
Riley knelt beside the body, his eyes scanning the gruesome tableau.
Cause of death? Riley asked, his voice flat.
Riley examined the body carefully, his mind working overtime.
Any defensive wounds?
Miller shook his head. Not really. A few scratches on her arms, but nothing significant.
It's too early to say, but something feels off about this one.
Riley didn't answer right away. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the chaotic scene once more.
Get me everything you've got on Eleanor Davis.
Miller nodded, his face grim.
Already on it, John. But don't get your hopes up. She was a quiet old lady, kept to herself.
Riley didn't answer. He was already lost in thought, his mind racing to connect the dots. This wasn't the first elderly person to be murdered in recent months. The first victim, a retired accountant, had been found in his study, his eyes gouged out, his tongue severed. Was there a connection? Riley wasn't sure, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't rest until he found the answers. Hours later, as the first rays of dawn pierced through the gaps in the blinds, Riley found himself back at his desk. The apartment had yielded few clues. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no DNA. He lit another cigarette, the smoke curling up towards the ceiling. He took a long drag from his cigarette, the nicotine a temporary balm to his frayed nerves, and then, like a whisper in the darkness, it hit him. The victims, they were all elderly, yes, but they were also all single, and more importantly, they had all worked with children. He reached for the phone, a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had a hunch, and he was determined to see it through. The flickering flames of the fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls, painting grotesque figures that seemed to mock his every thought. Rain lashed against the windows, mimicking the storm raging within him. The name echoed in the silence of his mind. Cage. It wasn't a name, not really, more like a whisper, a phantom haunting the edges of his memories.
I had been just a boy, abandoned, left at the mercy of a system that cared little for broken souls like me. The orphanage had been a place of shadows and secrets, its cold, sterile walls holding a lifetime's worth of pain and despair. I remembered the faces, etched with a lifetime's worth of sorrows, each telling a silent story of loss and abandonment.
He remembered the hushed whispers, the stolen glances, the constant fear that clung to him like a shroud. And then there were the nightmares, vivid and terrifying, that haunted his sleep, leaving him gasping for air in the cold, unforgiving darkness. They were more than just dreams, he knew. They were echoes of a past he couldn't quite remember, fragments of a shattered mirror reflecting a reality too horrible to comprehend.
I had tried to bury those memories, to lock them away in the deepest recesses of my mind. But some wounds ran too deep, some scars refused to heal. They lingered beneath the surface, festering, waiting for the right moment to erupt, to consume me. And now, as I stared into the flames, I could feel the darkness stirring, whispering my name, beckoning me back to the shadows.
The orphanage stood atop a windswept hill, overlooking the sprawling cityscape like a watchful gargoyle. Its once grand facade was now weathered and cracked, the paint peeling like scabs from a festering wound. The iron gates, rusted and overgrown with ivy, seemed to bar entry to the outside world, imprisoning its inhabitants within its cold embrace.
Inside, the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and despair. The walls, painted a sickly shade of green, seemed to absorb the light, leaving the corridors perpetually shrouded in shadow. The children, dressed in ill-fitting hand-me-downs, moved like ghosts, their eyes downcast, their voices hushed. They were but shadows, forgotten souls adrift in a sea of indifference.
Among them moved the caretakers, their faces etched with a weariness that ran deeper than mere fatigue. Some were kind, their eyes holding a flicker of compassion in the face of such overwhelming despair. But others, their hearts hardened by years of witnessing such misery, wielded their authority with a cruel indifference that bordered on malice.
It was in this crucible of despair that my spirit had been forged, my innocence sacrificed at the altar of survival. I learned to navigate the treacherous currents of this unforgiving world, to trust no one, to rely only on myself. I became a master of disguise, my true self hidden behind a mask of indifference, my pain buried deep within, a smoldering ember waiting for the chance to ignite.
There were whispers of things that went on behind closed doors, of punishments meted out in the dead of night, of screams muffled by thick walls. Cage learned to block out the sounds, to turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. Survival in this place demanded a certain ruthlessness, a willingness to turn away from the pain of others.
But some things were impossible to ignore. I remembered the faces of my tormentors, their smiles cruel and predatory, their eyes gleaming with a disturbing light. They were the keepers of order, the dispensers of justice, but behind their facade of respectability lurked a darkness that chilled me to the bone.
They played their twisted games, using their power to manipulate and control, to inflict pain and humiliation. They preyed on the weak, the vulnerable, the ones who had no one to protect them. And Cage, he was their favorite target. He was small for his age, quiet and watchful, his silence mistaken for weakness, his intelligence underestimated.
I endured their cruelty with a stoicism that belied my tender years. I learned to anticipate their every move, to read the subtle shifts in their demeanor, the glint in their eyes that betrayed their true intentions. I became a master of avoidance, a phantom flitting through the shadows, always one step ahead of their grasp. But deep down, a seed of vengeance had been planted, a slow-burning rage that would one day consume me.
The faces of his tormentors blurred together, a grotesque tapestry of cruelty and indifference. There was Eleanor Davis, the seemingly kindly schoolteacher, her smile masking a heart as cold as ice. She had a penchant for humiliation, for breaking spirits with a well-placed word, a disdainful glance, a public shaming that left its victims feeling small and insignificant.
Then there was Mr. Henderson, the stern-faced accountant, his every action ruled by a rigid adherence to order and control. He saw weakness as a flaw to be eradicated, and his punishments were swift and brutal, leaving their mark not just on the flesh, but on the very soul of his victims. And there were others, their faces fading in and out of focus, their crimes a litany of abuses, both physical and emotional.
Through it all, Cage clung to a single possession, a small wooden figure he had found hidden in the attic of the orphanage. It was crudely carved, its features barely discernible, but it represented something more than just a toy. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was still beauty to be found in the world.
He would spend hours talking to the figure, pouring out his pain, his fear, his rage. It became his confidant, his only solace in a world that seemed devoid of compassion. And as he whispered his secrets to the wooden figure, a plan began to take shape in his mind, a plan for revenge, for retribution, for making his tormentors pay for the pain they had inflicted upon him and countless others.
The years passed, each one an eternity in the confines of the orphanage. But Cage never forgot the faces of his tormentors, their names etched into his memory with the bitter ink of hatred. He watched them come and go, their lives moving on, their crimes seemingly forgotten by all but their victims, but Cage never forgot.
He kept a list, hidden away in a secret compartment of his wooden figure. Names, dates, details of their crimes, all meticulously recorded, a testament to his unwavering resolve. He studied their lives, their routines, their weaknesses, waiting for the day when he would exact his revenge.
He left the orphanage a changed soul, the innocence of youth forever extinguished. He carried with him the scars of his past, both physical and emotional, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked within him. He vowed to never be a victim again, to make the world pay for the pain it had inflicted upon him.
He embraced the shadows, becoming a phantom, a whisper of darkness in the night. He honed his skills, training his mind and body to become a weapon, a tool of retribution. He was no longer the scared little boy cowering in the corner. He was Cage, the embodiment of vengeance, and his time had come.
He started with Eleanor Davis. She had been the first on his list, her cruelty etched into his memory like a brand. He had watched her for weeks, studying her routine, her habits, her weaknesses. He knew her movements like a predator stalking its prey.
He entered her apartment on a night like this, the rain masking his arrival, the darkness his ally. He could smell her fear, a tangible thing in the close confines of her home. She had aged, her beauty faded, replaced by a fragility that only fueled his rage.
He watched her sleep, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. He could have ended it quickly, painlessly, but that wasn't his way. He wanted her to suffer, to feel the terror that had haunted his dreams for so long. He wanted her to know that he had come for her, that her past had finally caught up with her.
He let out a low growl, a sound that echoed in the silence of the room. Her eyes fluttered open, widening in recognition as she saw him standing over her. He savored the look of terror in her eyes, the way her breath caught in her throat. This was what he had lived for, this moment of absolute power, this taste of vengeance. And it was just the beginning.
The insistent ringing of the phone jolted Riley from his thoughts. He picked up the receiver, his voice rough with fatigue.
Riley.
It was Miller, his voice laced with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty.
John, you were right. I pulled the files on the other two victims.
Riley took a drag from his cigarette, his mind already racing ahead.
Give it to me, Miller.
All 3 victims, Miller continued, they all worked at the same orphanage, St. Michael's Orphanage, up on Hawthorne Hill. It closed down about 20 years ago, but he trailed off, leaving the unspoken question hanging in the air. Riley's blood ran cold. St. Michael's. He knew that name. He had tried to bury it, to erase it from his memory, but some things were impossible to forget.
Miller, get me everything you can on St. Michael's, staff records, incident reports, anything and everything. And Miller...
Yeah, John?
I'm on my way.
He slammed down the phone, a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. It all made sense now. The victims, the brutality, the seeming randomness of it all, it was all connected, and he knew exactly who was behind it. He grabbed his coat and his fedora, his movements fueled by a potent mixture of dread and determination. He had to get to St. Michael's, and fast. He had a feeling that the killer was already there, waiting for him. And this time, he wouldn't let him get away. This time, he would face his demons head on. This time, he would get his justice. The drive to St. Michael's was a blur of rain-slicked streets and flashing neon signs. He pushed his car to its limits, the roar of the engine a guttural scream. Racing towards the orphanage, he realized some wounds never truly healed. Faces of victims flashed before his eyes like fading photographs. The past had come back to haunt him, dragging him to his nightmares. The old orphanage loomed before him, a skeletal silhouette against the storm-tossed sky. Rain lashed against the crumbling facade, the wind howling like a banshee. He parked the car, the engine sputtering its last. He stepped out into the downpour, the cold rain stinging his face. As he approached the entrance, his eyes scanned the dilapidated building. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the knob, but he had come too far to turn back now. The interior of the orphanage was shrouded in darkness, the only light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and decay, the silence broken only by the creaking of the floorboards beneath his feet. He moved cautiously through the derelict building, his senses on high alert. He had been here before, a lifetime ago, but the layout was still etched in his memory. He remembered the long, echoing corridors, the cramped dormitories, the oppressive weight of silence that seemed to permeate every nook and cranny. As he explored the building, he found himself drawn to the old records room, a small, forgotten space tucked away at the end of a dusty corridor. The door creaked open, revealing a scene of utter chaos. Filing cabinets lay overturned, their contents scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Papers were strewn everywhere, their edges yellowed with age, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust. He knelt down, sifting through the debris, his fingers tracing over faded ink and brittle paper. He was searching for something, anything that would connect the victims, something that would shed light on the killer's motive. And then he saw it, a single sheet of paper lying half concealed beneath a pile of discarded files. It was a staff roster from the year the orphanage had closed down. He ran his finger down the list of names, his heart pounding in his chest. And there it was, at the very bottom of the page, written in a cramped, almost illegible hand. Cage. The name hit him like a physical blow, sending a chill down his spine. Cage, a spectre from his past. He remembered the stories, the whispers of a boy who disappeared without a trace. He could feel the killer's presence now, a palpable weight in the stagnant air. He had to stop Cage, had to prevent him from claiming another victim. And then it hit him. There was one name missing from the list of victims, his own. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He had been so focused on the past, on the victims, that he had failed to see the present danger. Cage wasn't finished. He had saved the most personal for last. He raced back through the orphanage, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He burst out into the storm-ravaged night, rain lashing against his face, blurring his vision. He could see the figure in the distance, a solitary silhouette against the backdrop of the old oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of the grounds.
Cage!
He shouted, his voice torn apart by the wind and the rain. The figure turned, and for a moment their eyes met across the chasm of years. Riley stopped dead in his tracks, his blood running cold. The face staring back at him was not the one he had expected. It was not a monster, not a demon, but a man twisted and scarred by pain, his eyes burning with a cold, hard light.
You.
Riley breathed, his voice barely a whisper.
It was you all along.
Cage smiled, a chillingly empty expression that sent shivers down Riley's spine.
Hello, Detective. I've been expecting you.
He held up a hand, and in his palm Riley saw the glint of a blade, its polished surface reflecting the lightning that flashed across the sky.
Let's finish this, shall we?
The rain intensified, a torrent of icy water that soaked them to the bone. Lightning split the sky, illuminating Cage's face in a grotesque tableau of shadows and light. His eyes, once filled with the innocence of youth, now burned with a cold, hard light, reflecting the storm raging within him. He held the blade aloft, its polished surface gleaming like a beacon in the darkness.
You were supposed to be different.
Riley said, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of years of unspoken pain.
We were all victims here, Cage. We were all just children.
He took a step closer, his hand hovering near his holster, but he knew that even if he drew his weapon, it would be too late. Cage was faster, driven by a rage that Riley understood all too well.
Different?
Cage laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the night.
They stole our innocence, Riley. They took everything from us.
He gestured towards the looming silhouette of the orphanage, its windows like vacant eyes staring down at them.
This place, these people, they made us what we are. No, we choose who we become. We choose to break the cycle of pain, or we become the monsters that haunted us.
He met Cage's gaze, refusing to back down, even as the rain stung his eyes and the wind whipped at his coat.
Don't do this, Cage. It's not too late. We can stop this together.
Cage's expression hardened, his grip tightening on the blade.
There is no stopping this, Riley. It's been set in motion a long time ago.
He lunged, a swift, predatory movement that caught Riley off guard. The blade whistled through the air, a silver arc aimed at Riley's heart. Riley twisted, feeling the wind of the blade against his cheek. Adrenaline surged through him, sharpening his senses, fueling his every move. They fought, a deadly dance of shadows and steel under the relentless downpour. Riley, older and wearier, relied on his experience. His years on the force, honing his instincts, his movements economical, precise. Cage, fueled by a lifetime's worth of rage and resentment, fought with a feral grace, his attacks swift, unpredictable, deadly. Each parry, each thrust was a desperate gamble, a dance on the razor's edge between life and death. The rain obscured their vision, the wind muffling their grunts of exertion. The only sounds were the clash of steel, the hiss of the blade cutting through the air, and the pounding of their hearts, a primal rhythm that echoed the storm raging around them. Riley felt a searing pain in his shoulder as Cage's blade found its mark. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the warm trickle of blood that ran down his arm. He couldn't afford to hesitate, not now. He had to end this for his own sake, for the sake of the victims, for the memory of the scared little boy he had once been. Cage pressed his attack, his movements fueled by a desperate fury. He backed Riley against the trunk of the old oak tree, its rough bark digging into his back. The blade flashed again, this time aimed at Riley's throat. Riley parried just in time, the impact jarring his aching bones. He could taste blood, metallic and sharp on his tongue.
It didn't have to be this way.
Riley gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts.
We could have helped each other. We could have found a different way.
He saw a flicker of doubt in Cage's eyes, a brief moment of hesitation that gave Riley a sliver of hope.
There is no other way. They need to pay for what they did. All of them.
He raised the blade again, his face contorted in a mask of pain and fury, his finger tightening on the hilt.
Then you leave me no choice,
Riley said, a coldness settling over him, a grim acceptance of the task before him. He lunged, not at Cage, but at the hand holding the blade. He heard a sickening crunch as his fist connected with Cage's wrist. The blade clattered to the ground, disappearing into the shadows. Cage cried out, a mixture of pain and rage, as he stumbled back, clutching his injured hand. Riley wasted no time. He tackled Cage, bringing him crashing to the ground. The rain beat down on them, washing away the blood, the sweat, the years of unspoken pain that had led them to this moment. They grappled in the mud, their struggle a tangled mess of limbs and fury.
It's over, Cage.
Riley said, his voice hoarse, his chest heaving.
You don't have to do this anymore.
He could feel Cage's body go limp beneath him, his resistance fading. He looked down into Cage's eyes, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the boy who had been emotionally and mentally scarred.
It's too late. I couldn't stop myself.
He coughed, a rattling sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest.
It's already done.
Riley's blood ran cold.
Done? What's done? Who else, Cage?
Cage's eyes fluttered closed, his body racked with a tremor. He coughed again, this time a splatter of blood staining his lips.
Forgive me.
He whispered, his voice fading to a raspy sigh. And then he went still. Riley felt a cold dread grip his heart as he checked for a pulse. There was none. Cage was gone. The rain continued to fall, mirroring the turmoil within him. He had caught his man, but at a terrible cost. He slowly rose to his feet, his clothes soaked through. Upon further checking, he found a faint pulse. Realizing Cage was alive, he called for help. He would ensure Cage's final act was not in vain. Riley walked away, leaving behind the ghosts of his past. The clanging of the cell door echoed in the sterile hallway, a final punctuation mark on Cage's trial. Days turned into weeks as Cage sat in his cell, the monotony of prison life setting in. Riley was at home when the news broke. The news of Cage's escape hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew he had to act fast.
The reporter's voice was a dull drone in the background, detailing the daring escape from a maximum security prison. The guards found bound and gagged, their eyes wide with terror. No one, it seemed, had seen Cage leave. He had simply vanished, like a ghost returning to the shadows from which he had been spawned.
Riley reached for his whiskey, the amber liquid sloshing in the glass as he swirled it, watching the ice clink against the sides. He couldn't afford to be surprised, not anymore. He had looked into the abyss, had stared down the face of evil, and it had changed him irrevocably. He had seen the darkness that lurked within the human heart, the capacity for both great love and unspeakable cruelty. The phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the silence of his thoughts. He answered on the second ring, his voice roughened by countless nights fueled by cheap whiskey and the gnawing ache of unfinished business. "Riley," he growled, his voice barely a whisper.
The voice on the other end was a low, distorted growl, barely audible above the static, yet unmistakable. "Hello, John," the voice hissed, a chilling echo of a shared past. "Did you miss me?"
Riley's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles turning white. "Where are you, Cage?" he asked, his voice a low growl, a predator sensing its prey. Cage's laughter echoed through the receiver, a chilling sound that sent shivers down Riley's spine. "You'll find out soon enough," he whispered, his voice a venomous caress. "We're not done yet, John. There's still one more name on my list." The line went dead, the dial tone a hollow echo in Riley's ear. He slammed the phone down, a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. He had known this wasn't over. Cage was a hunter, and his prey was still out there. He reached for his jacket, his movements fueled by a potent mix of dread and grim determination. He had brought Cage to justice once, and he would do it again. But this time it was personal. This time it wasn't just about justice for the victims, but for the redemption of a soul lost in the shadows. He had glimpsed the scared, broken boy beneath the mask of the monster, and he knew that Cage's final act of vengeance would be aimed at the one person who could have saved him from himself. The rain continued to lash against the windows, mirroring the storm raging within him. He had no leads, no clues, only the chilling certainty that Cage was out there, waiting, watching, his patience as sharp as the blade he wielded. The hunt was on, and this time there would be no escape. This time it would end in blood.